Hi, podcast listeners. Welcome to the A World of Difference podcast. We have so many guests on this show making a difference in our lives, making a difference all around the world with the expertise that they bring. And yet so many of you are reaching out to me saying, you want more. It's not enough just what we're putting on these podcast episodes for you. And so I am here to extend a very warm welcome to you to our Difference Maker community, where you can join for as little as $5 a month to get all this extra content. Out the gate, you're going to get 30 plus minisodes of exclusive content not available for the regular podcast listeners, and an exclusive minisode every month. And you'll get exclusive voting power to help us pick podcast topics and more. And that's at our Changers tier. There's 3 different main tiers and then an extra larger tier. But whatever tier that you join at, you will be included in this extra content. And I know that many of you are wanting to go a little bit deeper. And so even though it gets a little wild in there sometimes because of how deep we go, I want you to join us there. This extra content is very special. It means a great deal to me to be a part of this community with you. And I would love to just exchange ideas or perspectives that you have around these different episodes. And that's the place where we do it. So please show up to our Difference Maker community. Give us $5 out of your pocket every month. And I think that you'll have a lot of fun in there because we do. And I would love for you to join us. So go to patreon.com/A World of Difference to join us there. Welcome to the A World of Difference podcast. I'm Lori Adams Brown, and this is a podcast for those who are different and want to make a difference. So our year has ended and a new year has begun, and it's that time once again to revisit our most popular podcast from the year before. And to my utter surprise, our most popular podcast by far last year was the first episode of the Our Story series. So episode 100 of the podcast is where Jason Adams Brown, my husband, and I began to tell our story of what happened in a hostile work environment, of spiritual abuse, of working as pastors at a mega church in Silicon Valley. And so the Our Story series, for part 1 of 6 parts, is the most by far popular podcast and most downloaded and listened to and engaged podcast of all of last year. And I just want to say to all the listeners who have listened to our story, parts 1 through 6, which were all very much downloaded and listened to and shared and passed along, what an honor it is to have each of you who have listened, especially those who have reached out to us, to say how just hearing our story helped you understand your own, and that you are not alone, and that this pattern is something that exists in some other places that are also toxic church environments, toxic church cultures on staffs. And although it has been very heartbreaking to hear each of your stories, it has also been an honor to hold them with you, to hold space for each of you, to lament with you, to say we have been down this road a little bit further and a little bit behind some of you, and that we're all on this journey of healing together. And in that has been, in its own way, a version of healing we didn't expect. Sharing our story took a lot of courage. It took a lot of counting the cost and forethought, but we felt that the risks were definitely less than the benefits that could be gained by sharing the narrative of what happened to us together and how we have been healing from it throughout all this time. And it turns out that was a risk that was worth taking, because by far the outpouring of just feedback we've gotten from each of you has been that of gratitude and saying me too, and sharing the particular parts of your story that you resonated with in ours. So isn't that how it works? That when we share a narrative of our own lives, then often others can relate to it, and vice versa. I know that part of the reason we shared our story was because others had shared theirs with us, both in our own church here in Silicon Valley, but also in some other mega church environments with pastors who are friends with the mega church pastors that have created such an abusive culture that has abused so many here. And so for those of you that were new to the spiritual abuse conversation, and many of you expressed that that was the case, we've been able to meet up with some of you here in person, here in Silicon Valley, reconnect with friends from throughout our life that have resonated with it, and also many, many, many new people that we've gotten to meet through this. So I just want to say, as we recast this episode once again and drop it for the world to hear again, that it really has been such an honor to have each of you listen and empathize with our story and share yours with us too. It's a very special, sacred space where we're all healing together, and we could not be more honored and more full of joy to share this journey once again with you. So as you listen, just another trigger warning that this content contains stories of spiritual abuse, psychological abuse, emotional abuse, and also some financial abuse. And so if that is part of your journey, any type of abuse or religious trauma of any kind, I just want to let you know that it is okay to not listen at all if that's not something that is good for you to do right now. It's okay for you to listen in chunks. It's okay for you to listen to it in a way that your body feels safe and feels comfortable, whether that's with a cozy blanket, a hot chocolate with some whipped cream, sitting by a fireplace, floating in a warm pool on a sunny tropical day with headphones in, driving with beautiful scenery nearby, like letting the hammock hug you between two palm trees, skiing down slopes in Tahoe, whatever your body would feel most safe and comfortable in at this moment. To have to listen to something hard that may be triggering if you've walked through trauma or abuse of any kind, just know that whatever you need to do to take care of yourself, that's what we would suggest. And if you're listening to this again and you listened to it before, there may be parts of it that are re-triggering, and it's okay to just stop it where it is. Take some deep breaths, center yourself, do, tapping, or do any kind of DBT therapy that your therapist has recommended. We just want you to know that our utmost desire is that you are in a space where you are healing. And if this podcast could help you heal further, then we offer it to you, but we would not want to do anything that would make that more difficult. All that being said, for each of you who have decided not to keep your head in the sand, whether you have or haven't experienced spiritual abuse, but especially for those of you who have not, it can be hard to still hear that. Just because you haven't experienced anything like this doesn't mean it's not still very, very hard to hear, and it takes a lot of courage. And so for each of you who have listened to this before or listened to our story in person, we know that that has taken its own version of courage. And we just want to say thank you for wanting to be aware of the signs so that you can be a part of the solution of helping overcome obstacles of spiritual abuse wherever it might find itself. And particularly for those of you who are at Echo.Church who have found this podcast series to be what has helped set you free as a captive, and there have been a few of you, we just want to say we are so honored that you would take this journey too with us. It's not an easy road, but we have found the freedom of speaking the truth, of not signing the NDA, of God arranging circumstances for us so that we could actually do that by bringing resources into our lives, books like Dr. Scott McKnight and Laura Barringer's A Church Called Tove that help open my eyes, and stories of a few survivors that had gone before me at Echo that helped me to see. So I once again offer our story to you, part 1 of 6 parts, and we just prayerfully and humbly offer it once again to the world. And if this resonates with you at all, we would once again always love to hear from you. So here it is again. Our story, part 1 of spiritual abuse at Echo.Church in Silicon Valley. We wanted to bring to you a very special episode. Many of you may have heard me speak on a couple of podcasts recently or read some articles about the story that my husband, Jason, and I walked through at Echo.Church here in Silicon Valley, with just a lot of spiritual abuse on the staff that my husband and I both experienced at the hands of Andy Wood and Felipe Santos. And we today just wanted to give you the opportunity to hear from us, our story from our own words. Some of it has been captured here and there, parts of it in articles by Julie Roys and Bob Smiatana of Religion News Service, as well as my friend Corey Nathan recently had me on the Talking Politics and Religion Without Killing Each Other podcast. It's on this week. And so we wanted to just give you a chance to hear our story from us. So to commemorate 100 episodes, we offer you very vulnerably, very honestly, the story that we walked through. So it's me and Jason today. Hello, we're here today, me, Lori Adams Brown, and my husband, Jason Adams Brown. And we're here today to share our story. We've had a lot of people asking about our story of our experience of working at Echo.Church here in Silicon Valley, because there's been some articles written about it by Julie Roys and Bob Smiatana of Religion News Service. I've been on a couple of podcasts, and then, of course, we've just had a lot of different people coming to us who have had experiences both at Echo.Church on staff and as volunteers, and also just noticing something that's not quite right as congregants. And then now that the situation now involves Saddleback Church, there's just a lot of people that have been asking a lot of questions. So, the one thing that Jason always said at the end of all of this last year was, one thing we can control is who we share our story with and how we share it and when we share it. And so we've decided, because of where we're at in our own journey of healing and wanting to just say what is true about what happened to us and to follow what we believe the scriptures say, which is to call out the wolves among us so that we can help warn the sheep and also help these wolves get the help that they need. We have decided to share our story today. We're not going to share it all at once because that's a lot to do. So we're going to take our time with it, and then we're going to reserve parts of our story for the Patreon supporters that want to go a little bit deeper into some nuances around our story. But this is just something we're offering to you today, our own particular story. And so we're just going to jump right into it. But I wanted to start with this question for my husband, Jason. Some people listening are coming in very skeptical. Maybe they're really good friends with the people we're discussing, and they've never seen a dark side of them at all, which was the case with us when we first came on staff as well. And so some people listening are sort of, maybe they see a few red flags, but it seems to be a lot to handle that somebody would be needing to be removed from ministry based on this, story that we're about to tell. So my first question for Jason is, what would you like for people to keep in mind as they're starting to listen to our story today in terms of their own posture and their own heart and their own mind? What is something you would like to say as we get started?
Yeah, thanks, Lori. I think I've said to a number of people that if I hadn't experienced it myself, I don't know what I would believe. In fact, when we came on staff, there were a few people that began to share concerns with us, and at the time, we had just come on staff, and I noticed that this person did seem somewhat disgruntled and upset. But what I didn't realize is a pattern that was happening was so often the people on staff were not seeing what was happening behind closed doors. They only saw what the person was doing on the outside that was really, really struggling. And so I didn't believe it when someone came to me. And so I do understand for those that have only experienced Andy and Felipe's good side, would say, man, I just can't see it. I've never seen that. And so I guess, I would just hope people would consider that, yeah, just to listen with an open heart and open mind. And I think another thing that I've said several times is that we're not doing this to hurt anybody. In fact, I have grave concerns for Annie and Felipe, and I really believe that if someone really cares about them, they would not want to keep putting them in a position that's going to be harmful to them and to where they could harm others. And so that's some major reasons why we share this. In fact, of course, obviously trying to protect others and to be a voice for those that have NDAs and or are still in major therapy and struggling and just do not have the strength to speak out right now. And so we want to speak for them as well. So, yeah, that's a couple of thoughts on that.
Yes, I'm with you on that. Care very deeply about the Wood family and the Santos family. I think that, Jason, you make a good point because there are people, it seems as though some people have given up, and I don't know if at some point that might be our posture. This is where we are today, but we still hold on to hope and have faith that God can bring restoration, reconciliation, resurrection out of this horrible, awful mess. And we believe our brothers, Andy and Felipe, both are behaving very, very badly. And I wish they hadn't behaved so badly in front of me because then I wouldn't have anything to say. But unfortunately, they did on more than one occasion. And many stories came to me in the aftermath in the last year and a half of people who worked on staff and worked on staff for years before I was even there. And even since the articles came out, have contacted us and shared their story. Even this week, a couple of new ones came to us. And so it's to the point where it is just undeniable that there needs to be some sort of intervention to stop these two men from hurting other people and from the deception that they have surrounded themselves with for so long. We're going to give you some resources in the show notes throughout this, however many podcast episodes this goes for, because there have been several books and several authors and people who care and love the church and want to see the church restored that have really been helpful to us in this journey. People who've done their doctoral dissertations around this topic. And so there are resources that can be helpful. And that's just what we're hoping for. We've not given up on our brothers. And it's because we believe that change can happen and should happen that we speak out. So that's the posture into which we come into this podcast. And we hope that you will keep an open mind and an open heart, open ears to truly listen to the story. And we could probably never go into all the details of it because we're still unpacking some of it ourselves. But we want to just offer it to you as something that can help you understand the nature of what has gone on at Echo, what still is going on in that system, in that church, and what is now being brought into Saddleback at this point. And so we just offer it to you as our story. That's pretty much all we have. So I'm going to start off with Jason, and he can sort of explain the circumstances under which he met Andy Wood originally, and then why it was that we came to start working at Echo.Church. Just kind of sum that up in a nutshell.
Oh, gosh. Yeah, so we came to Cupertino actually on a stateside assignment in 2017 and 2018. And when we were coming here, there were a number of people who said, hey, if you're going to come to that area, you really should check out South Bay Church. And I actually, when I realized who the pastor was, which was Andy Wood, back in, I think it was 2011 or 2012, I can't remember the exact date, uh, but Andy Wood came out on a trip with some other pastors that I was in charge of like half their trip in Singapore and in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia, and had actually interacted with him at that point. And so, yeah, so we definitely are open to like, hey, this could be our church for that one year for our kids and everything. And so we became involved. We were really excited to see how this was a church that was really seemed to want to impact the Silicon Valley, really wanted to reach the community here. And at the time thinking, oh, they're trying to be contextual. They're trying to be almost like someone that's working overseas. They want to really reach this community, and so there are a lot of things that we just didn't see as just coming on the weekends and getting to know them and seeing only Andy and Felipe's good side. So we developed some friendships with them, and at one point I even thought, hey, what if we could partner with Echo Church and Andy and Felipe and actually start a church in Singapore that could even be a campus, could even be like an extension or a church plant from them, and so begin to kind of cast vision to them for that. And so Andy immediately was super excited. He shared with me, hey, this is like, nobody knows this yet. Very few people know this yet, but we're actually changing our name from South Bay to Echo Church. And that really fits the vision of wanting to what happens in Silicon Valley echoes throughout the world. And so, um, we would love to see the possibility of doing that. And so they came on a 3 day, it was like this crazy, 3 day trip to Singapore, landed at like 6 a.m. on a Monday, and then left, Wednesday evening. And so I introduced them to Singapore, introduced them to friends and people that we knew there, some different partnerships and things like that. And just wanted to further the idea of what we could do there in that area. So came back after that 3 day trip. Um, and after our 1 year stateside assignment, we came back to Singapore. And after a year, some things developed that it was on some personal level, um, related to schooling and stuff for kids and things like that. I was like, not going into lots of detail. There's nothing major, but it was just some schooling issues with our kids. And when it was clear that we needed to come back to the U.S. And so at that time, I reached out to a number of different people, including Andy and Felipe, and just saying, "Hey, it looks like we're going to have to come back to the States. Is there? Do you have any roles at your church that you feel like um, I could help out with, and would be useful to Echo.Church?" So they came back and ended up offering both Lori and I jobs. I didn't know if you wanted to share a little bit about like your response when they reached back out to you, but
Yeah. So, I mean, as much as I thought Echo Church was a great place to be during our stateside assignment, we weren't there every Sunday by any means because we were speaking in a lot of churches because of the nature of what stateside assignment looks like for people who work with the International Mission Board, as we did at the time. So we were often out of town on the weekends speaking at other churches. But when we were in town, and not speaking somewhere, we were often at Echo. And so it was, like he said, a great experience. Our kids loved it. Our oldest really liked the students group and the student leader there. And we met people that had come out on a missions trip to Singapore from Echo Church that were all on staff, minus just a few of them, and just loved everybody that we knew. It was just a lot of good relationships. However, when Jason mentioned some circumstances changed related to schooling for kids and all that, we had to make a decision. So we went to a time of prayer and fasting. For about 6 weeks, we reached out to all of our prayer partners and just said, "Hey, would you pray with us?" We were trying to decide, does this mean we need to figure out, where else to be in Asia? Does this mean we need to go somewhere else in the world? Does this mean something's happening here in Singapore that's going to be different schooling wise that we don't understand? So it's really just laying it all on the table around that time. And then for me, even though everything's on the table and you're always putting your yes on the table for whatever God would ask you to do, we all have our preferences. So my preferences would never have been in line with working at a church on a church staff. It just, for whatever reason, that was just not something I'd ever wanted to do. There was a previous furlough back when we were in Raleigh at Summit Church, and I remember there being, thrown out this option that I could work there in the Summit in Espanol if that was something I was interested in. And as much as I loved that ministry, just the idea of working in a church on a staff was just something I never really had wanted personally. It's not really where I felt my gifts lie or where my desires were. I always felt like if I stopped working with IMB, I would probably go into something like international business or international relations or some kind of nonprofit work that was global. But the idea of working in a church on a staff was just not something I had ever wanted. And definitely the idea of becoming a pastor, although theologically I believe I'm an egalitarian both at church and in the home. That's what my theology is and has been for a really long time. It wasn't an issue of whether or not I believed women could be pastors, because I certainly believe that. And it's not an issue of whether or not I have gifts in leadership, because I certainly do and have always been told that since I was very young. But it was more just an issue of that's just not where I saw myself. And so when the circumstances came to where Andy and Felipe wanted to do a Zoom call with us and offer us the 2 jobs, the job for me was going to be, if I took it, associate campus pastor for the Sunnyvale campus, which was the second largest Echo campus at the time. And the campus that we had actually been involved in being congregants of when we were here during that stateside. So, but when they came to offer us those 2 jobs on the Zoom call, I really just had no interest. I think there were 3 different times they asked if I would want to take the job. And I just said, no, I don't want this job. And for all the reasons I mentioned, and also because, and I ended up, I think after the third time, I said, no, I don't really want to do that. I was going to start thinking, if Jason took the job at Echo.Church, I was thinking I would apply for jobs in Silicon Valley and just some of the tech companies around like diversity and inclusion or learning and development, something along those lines. So around the third time, I said, I don't really want to take this job. Andy or Felipe, can't remember which one, said on the Zoom call, why do you keep saying, no, you don't want this job? And I explained, really, I don't want to work in a church. It's not a desire that I have. I'll do anything God asks me to do, but it's just not a desire. So unless I felt God strongly leading me, I really wasn't going to do something like that. But also because having been, Southern Baptist my whole life, although there's a lot of nuance in the Southern Baptist world in terms of theology around egalitarianism and complementarianism, increasingly over my years in the IMB, it had become more complementarian over time for a variety of reasons. And so I didn't really want to bring that kind of scrutiny on myself or my family, my kids, for people to say things they might say about, oh, your mom's a pastor, she's a heretic, or whatever people might say. And I also just didn't need to have that title or make that point or even have a desire for it. So when I mentioned that, Andy said, oh, that's the reason? Well, don't worry. We'll fight that for you. And we just want you to lead, and we'll fight that for you. Which was an interesting thing because it turns out at the very beginning of our prayer and fasting time 6 weeks earlier, I'd felt very clearly God speak to me through Exodus when I was reading chronologically around the verse where God tells the Israelites, I will fight for you. You just have to be still. And so that had been my posture for the whole 6 weeks of just being still and listening and watching and waiting for God to fight for me. And so when that statement was said, it kind of shook me. Like I hadn't heard that in the whole 6 weeks from anyone's mouth in any of the scenarios of our prayer partners reaching out to us. And so I said, well, okay, I really should pray about this then, because it felt like that might be God's answer, even though it wasn't the one I wanted. So we ended the call. I went and sat immediately on the little spot by the window in our high-rise apartment where I could overlook the nearby trees and the birds and the hill near us and Gwilyn View. And as I barely had even sat down, and I really sensed God saying, this is me. This is me fighting for you. You're going to go work at Echo.Church. And it was good to have an answer. There was a relief in that, like, oh, okay, this is what we're doing. But at the same time, it was not at all my heart's desire. My heart did not desire to leave Singapore. I knew my kids didn't want to leave Singapore. We loved the work that we're doing. There was still more work to be done. I could have seen myself there for many, many more years. But out of obedience, I took this role because I knew it was what God wanted, which is a really hard thing to say because it ended up being a lot of suffering and that journey of that position at Echo.Church. And I do have a lot of thoughts around that we can talk about later. But I do believe that God sometimes allows, but does not cause suffering, and allows us to walk through that because God is a God who is a man of sorrows, acquainted with grief, and has nail-scarred hands to show that he has walked through pain and suffering and shows us how. And understands spiritual abuse, being rejected by your own faith community and your own close friends. He had a Judas that betrayed him, and so God understands. Doesn't mean God causes it, but I still stand by the fact that God led us to do this, and I believe that part of it was people were praying for many, many years. I found out in the aftermath. When we met a couple that had originally planted the church with the Woods and the Santos that had been praying for about 7 years for things to be restored and change, and so many others had too. And so our story is a very small part of many, many things God has done and is doing to help restore and bring resurrection and reconciliation. And it kind of involves taking up your cross if you want to be a part of it, unfortunately, in many situations. And so, yeah, that's kind of the circumstances under which we came to join Echo.Church. It was pretty fast when we left Singapore and got here, and it was a bit of a whirlwind. So I'll start off my initial impressions of Echo, and then I'll let Jason kind of give a few of his. But we had been told in the Zoom calls that we would have a couple weeks to settle in. One of the Zoom calls that we did just with Andy, he called us one night and said, hey, I just want to have a Zoom call with you around this thing. I think he was getting his kids to bed because Stacy was leading students that night. And so he was at home, and it was just kind of like this last minute, real quick one. Do you have any questions for me? And the one question I had for him was, what do you believe about spiritual authority? And that was because that's a theology that's very important to me. I had seen, not personally, but I'd heard stories, even in some big Singaporean mega churches, where some pastors had really abused their power with the congregation. And in some cases done some pretty illegal things. There's some famous situations in Singapore where American pastors had come in and advised Singaporean pastors to do certain things that are highly illegal in Singapore, and those pastors went to jail and they weren't allowed to do those things. So I knew there were, situations in America where mega pastors in the States were doing things that weren't right. I just never imagined Andy or Felipe would be those people because I knew them. So I guess betrayal blindness was something I was already a part of even at that point. But I remember asking Andy, what do you believe about spiritual authority? And his answer, looking back, was he knew exactly what I wanted to hear and said exactly what I wanted to hear. So I'd take the job to appease me. But as soon as I got on staff and started watching the prayer meetings and how it felt like this almost really close to a deification at times of Andy as the lead pastor and separating him above the rest in a way that was very hierarchical. And there were a lot of circumstances around that. I began to realize this is not at all what he said. He really does have a very different view of spiritual authority. My theology is that there's God who's above all, and there's all of humanity who will be, in Revelation 7:9, all equal before the throne. And then Jesus came to sort of flip that hierarchy and show us in Philippians 2 how to serve and how to love, and didn't consider authority something to be grasped, but took the form of a servant. I did not see that happening with Andy on staff, and did not see his staff treating him that way. And he was feeding off of it, and that was part of it. But it was confusing because his original statement to me was very much kind of what I wanted to hear, it felt like. And then also in that original Zoom call, he said, hey, I just wanted to make sure you understand you will not be on our leadership team when you first arrive. And it was sort of like, oh, okay, sure. We didn't know anything about anything. We were just like, okay, that sounds fine. We're new. Sure, makes sense, But for whatever reason, he wanted to be very clear we would not be in the leadership team. And once again, we just were following what God asked us to do, and we just trusted him because we had seen his good side, and we felt like, okay, that sounds fine. We trust you. So that was the situation under like the one kind of Zoom call we had about the job with Andy. And then when we arrived, it turns out within a couple days, while I'm still in jet lag, I was asked to meet with my boss, who was the campus pastor at Sunnyvale, and he was not waiting the 2 weeks for me to move in. So I don't know if there was not a communication about that, if he was just so burnt out and desperate, because it turns out very soon into my job, I realized that he was very burnt out, which was a common thing on staff. And there was a high attrition rate I began to see and hear stories about very early on in the first month. I also noticed in the first month, I didn't have time to move in with my family. It was like, hey, everybody just get in school and go. And like, I've got to go to work, and we've got to just figure this. You guys got to figure out how to walk to school. It was just very intense, just right away. And so as I got into things, I started to realize that there were systems that seemed to not be solid for a church that had been around for 12 years or so. It seemed that systems were constantly being reinvented and redone, and everything felt like all of a sudden last minute. Like we always know when Christmas is and when Easter is, but it seemed as though suddenly it was a last minute on a Saturday, even though we've known about this, or, oh, last minute change. We're going to reprint this entire bulletin for Sunday and spend a lot of money. So it was, of all the work I've done around the world and systems with different teams and global teams with different cultures and different workplaces since, college and seminary and overseas that I've been involved in, I had just never seen anything that felt so last minute when everything looked so strategic on the outside. So there were definitely some red flags in the beginning, and I was confused by them. And when I would sort of ask about it, people would sometimes say, well, it's because people leave and we have to redo that, which was true. So I started to realize there was a high attrition rate, but also it seemed to be more than that. I couldn't quite put my finger on why everybody was so busy, but not talking about things that could really be proactive and not be so last minute and spend lots of money on things last minute. So What were your first initial impressions when you first got on staff, and maybe some things you noticed that didn't seem kind of like what Wade Mullen would describe as something's not right?
Yeah, for sure. And our roles were so different. So mine was a central role that was, missions and church planting, and um, with Lori's being a part of the campus and having to focus on the weekend experience, the weekend service, all that stuff, there was just so much more of a higher level of stress that I noticed on those that were working at the campus level. And like she said, things would happen last minute, and most people would try to take off Friday or Saturday, and then suddenly there would be some major change, and so anybody that was working at the campus had to drop everything or you know not be able to do stuff. So I'm like noticing these things, and I'm like, man, this just I kept. I know for me personally, I don't know, we talked about this early on, but it was like I just kept thinking, okay, I've never worked on staff at a church. I know I'm coming in here just like I would with any culture. I'm trying to learn. And so I really came in, and I think Lori did as well, where we're just like, okay, there's some cognitive dissonance on some things, but we've never experienced a church staff before. So we kept thinking, okay, maybe it's just that we haven't done this before. But I would say the biggest kind of red flags early on where I started to think something's not right, or at least looking back on it. Like I think at the time I had cognitive dissonance, but I kind of would push it away. The very first one that I can remember is I don't think we'd been at Echo very long at all, maybe just a couple of weeks. And I remember at this point, Andy and I, we were good friends and would hang out, and even others, I think, had commented to Lori how they thought, another person on staff actually said to Lori, they thought, oh, they put a lot of hope in me that I would be able to change things because I had the relationship skills, but also the hardworking skills to potentially being able to change some of these issues at Echo. And I just kept thinking, when she told me that, that was months later. I'm skipping ahead, where I was just like shocked, like what in the world? Why would they think I could do this? Or, and they've been here for years and years and years. Why are they waiting for someone like me to come in and do that? So anyway, but so 2 weeks in, Andy kind of looks at me with this big grin on his face, and he says, "Hey man, who do you think's more intimidating, me or Felipe?" I remember just thinking, what a weird question. I was like, I think I said like neither one of you. I've never thought either one of you as being intimidating, but it was clear like it was this competition between the two of them. Who would the staff actually find more intimidating? I just thought that was such a weird question. And I pushed it aside at the time, but later looking back, I'm like, oh, this makes so much sense. I think another one was where we were working late one day and trying to make some decisions, and we realized we needed Andy's input to be able to make a final decision. And I just looked at Felipe. I was like, "Hey, should I just give Andy a call and like ask him?" And Felipe looked at me and says, "Well, you could try. I mean, he still likes you." And I was like, "Wait, what? Like, what a weird, And they're like, they've been friends since college. And I do think, anyway, I just at the time I didn't think like it just caught me by surprise, but I didn't know what to think about it. But again, it's one of those things I just pushed aside. So that was a couple of things early on, and then of course just seeing the chaos of the weekend service and how it was just a lot of stress around that for the campus staff, and just seeing how much was having to be done there for sure.
Yeah, we definitely will probably have more to say in little side things that we do for our Patreon supporters around some of the details of it, but we'll try to get through sort of the main parts of our story for those of you listening, just generally speaking here in the audience today. And thank you once again for listening to our story. As people who've walked through spiritual abuse, part of the way we heal is to tell our stories. So just you listening today is really a part of just helping us heal. And when you can empathize and believe the person who's sharing the story, it really does just bring a little bit of healing. So we just thank you for listening and for helping us continue our healing journey. We've done a lot of healing, but with this kind of thing, it just takes time. So thank you for listening. I would say that, when I began to notice within a couple of weeks that the campus pastor I was working under, who's a really great guy and just really love him and his family, and felt like a brother during the time we worked together. We had some very special moments of working together. But it became very clear to me within a couple of weeks that he was burnt out. And so I had gone to Andy and mentioned it to him at this alpha retreat that we were on, and just said, hey, I think he's burnt out. And he said, okay, well, let's just give him a couple of weeks to get some therapy, and like, but don't tell anyone. You just do his job for him, and let's just keep this secret. And that, looking back, was the first time I was asked to keep a secret like that. And I remember at the time, just in my mind, sort of non-consciously thinking, but wouldn't people want to know so they could help him? People love him. Like, they really do. They would want to care for him, and they would be fine knowing he needed help. Of course, being in ministry is hard. I think most people know that. And he's young and has a young family, but it was definitely like, we don't want people to, that's just something we're going to keep secret. So don't tell anybody, and you just kind of do your job and his job for the next couple of weeks. And so that all happened. And then, like, over time, there were a lot of things like that. Like, let's just not let people know. Like, the image management was already being kind of groomed into me, and I was being trained without realize I was being trained in this culture. And at the time, like Jason mentioned, we were trained as MKs growing up overseas, and also having lived, and worked as expat workers for 20 years. Part of our training and value is that you don't go in and just judge a culture day one. You don't know. You got to learn the language. You got to learn the culture. So I would say it was a solid year in Indonesia, where we were fluent in Indonesian and we could really understand enough to say, oh, maybe that's right, maybe that's not right. But you don't really know for probably about a year. And so I remember thinking, well, anytime I saw things that weren't quite right and tried to sort of bring it up, either fully or just kind of hinting, it would be shut down. Like, you just don't know our culture yet. So I remember thinking, well, maybe I just don't know the culture yet. So I'm just going to just observe and watch and learn, which was both of our posture for that first solid year, for sure. There were a lot of red flags, I would say, leading up to a few months. We basically were only on staff just a few months before COVID hit. And I was starting to see enough there. But I think when COVID hit, I realized that because of my experience in tsunami relief, disaster relief, no one's their best self. And that was sort of a thing we would always talk about. That's why everybody needs breaks. This is intense work. So you better not be working more than 2 weeks at a time straight, because you're just going to burn out. So we had rhythms of how to rest that we had to implement in that intense season. And when COVID hit, we both sort of just knew, like, this needs to, like, we need to have good breaks. We can be intense for a little bit, but not like more than 2 weeks at a time. But that was just not at all the posture. I remember the first call, we were on with Andy on a Zoom when everything shut down, and I'll let Jason take over from that point because he was on that same call.
Yeah, so it was even part of that. It was interesting because I was just happened to be leading the prayer time for the staff that Wednesday of the week where it's all kind of hit in March 2020. Um, and I remember, like, I couldn't sleep. Like, I just woke up and it was like, I just feel like God was like depositing these just lessons that I felt like I had learned from our time in Indonesia when we were doing tsunami relief work and all of that, and just felt like, man, I mean, at the time we had no idea how long COVID was going to last. And so I was a little bit nervous because I thought, am I making a big deal about this? But man, I couldn't sleep. I just got up. I began to write down some different notes and just lessons I had learned during our time in doing this tsunami relief work. And so um, during the staff prayer time, I just went through all of those different lessons with them, things I had learned and all of that. And so that was really our frame of mind, was around um, how do we take, and a lot of it was not just about taking care of ourselves or that kind of stuff, but it was definitely was about that, but also not losing the opportunity that we have here as well to really serve and love the community, because this is going to be a unique time in history for us as a church. And so it was around lessons like those types of things, but also around watching yourself and realizing there's going to be a strong potential of people burning out by trying to do too much too fast. And so, and that was received really well. I don't even think Andy was at that prayer time. I don't think. I can't remember,
Yeah,
but
I think it was.
was he? Okay.
Oh,
Yeah. And so later we had a staff meeting, and this is where Andy began to kind of share his thoughts. And I don't really remember a lot, but what was really clear to me that was a bit bizarre was like right at the end of the call, Andy got really close to the screen and just said, "You all better be working." I just thought, whoa, like that was just weird. Like he didn't say, it felt like you all better be working or you're going to get fired. That's what it felt like, but that's
That's
not
what
what he
I
said.
felt. Yeah.
He just said, you all better be working. And I remember Lori telling me, he's like, man, what has happened in his past that made that be his biggest concern right off the bat? And so, but again, like, we didn't really talk about it much. We just thought, okay, nobody's their best self in COVID. Like, this is hard. There's so much pressure on him right now. There's probably a lot of fear, all that kind of stuff. Give grace, give grace, give grace.
Yeah. So give grace was a posture that I took quite a bit. And, it was really, I remember there being conversations, even in the aftermath of that particular one, where they would talk about all these other churches. And that became a part of echo culture that we began to observe. Echo, they would never say Echo is the very best church, but there would be other ways that would be said on staff. It was often a pep rally on the staff, it felt like, to explain why we were the best without just saying those words. So, well, it was like, oh, all these other churches are at risk right now. They're probably going to have to close, but we operate in the black, so we won't have to, AKA we're better. And that was good. We were comforted, but at the same time, there was this fear. There was a lot of power by fear that you better be working really hard. That's why we are like this. That's why we're better. And you're going to get fired. It was, I don't remember all the conversations. It was sort of the oxygen that we breathed. And maybe it was because there was such a high attrition rate that you felt like Andy would either make you so miserable you would quit or would fire you. And, we knew he loved Elon Musk and read books by him. And, living here in Silicon Valley, I knew we had congregants who had worked at Tesla. In the job I've been doing all year, my business that I've worked at is near Tesla. So we know people that work at Tesla. And people don't like working for Elon Musk. He's not a pastoral guy. He's not a guy that should be a pastor because he makes, other products and business, but he doesn't run his business in a way that his employees really love working for him. And he was, somebody that Andy idolized and wanted to lead like and would read books by. So I think that was part of the oxygen we breathed is, oh, he's almost like an Elon Musk type of pastor. But that didn't feel pastoral at all, and it wasn't. And so when COVID hit, I felt like I hadn't seen him pastor for enough months to really know for sure how he was, just little red flags like I mentioned. But like Jason said, when COVID hit, I remember thinking everything's going to go in the grace basket because nobody's their best self right now. And at this point, the original boss I'd worked for, that campus pastor, had moved on to be online pastor. And then they had brought in a new guy, Darren, who's a great guy as well. Had worked in tech at Rocket Games for a while, and it was a brand new Christian, the top giver in the church financially, and then came on staff as a pastor, just very generous, and has done very well for himself, and just being in the right place and working in a really great company for a while. Great guy, love him, had a great working relationship with him, and but had he not been in ministry, that's something I had grown up in ministry family, and had been to seminary and worked in ministry for 20 years in many languages around the world. So in some ways it felt like the art of pastoring and the way of pastoring was something I was having to carry a bit of the load for early on. And especially because he took over just as COVID hit, I knew more people on the campus, even though they'd only been there a few months, than he did. So a lot of the pastoral type calls, which were heavy during COVID because people were getting sick with COVID, had anxiety about getting COVID. People had loved ones that were passing away. People were having to delay their weddings. There was a lot of pastoral care needs. But at the same time, Andy had this panic button that got pushed when COVID hit because we shut down. And his whole system of meeting in person, that was this flywheel that he always talked about, that you just never changed. How things run here, this flywheel of what happens on Sunday, and everything funnels into Sunday, and all of our efforts are about Sunday and a big Sunday service. You just don't mess with that flywheel. That was his baby, and that was not ever going to change. And not even COVID was going to make that change. But unfortunately, you couldn't meet in person. Santa Clara County did not allow us to meet in person. But he was constantly pushing against Dr. Sarah Cody's regulations. She would be brought up in prayer time, Dr. Sarah Cody, and it was the prayers around it felt like prayers that were trying to push her to change her mind so that we could meet in person. Not everybody felt that that was a good way to pray, because many of us appreciated in those early weeks of COVID that we were being protected from a virus that was killing people in our community. In the Bay Area, we have multi-generational housing. We have immigrants from all over the world. We have immunocompromised people. We have older people and babies in the same household. And so a lot of at-risk individuals. And my posture as a pastor was I didn't want us to be a super spreader. And so, many of us were grateful for Dr. Sarah Cody helping to, save lives during those early weeks. But it felt like there was a constant push against her in our prayer times, and that Andy felt frustrated by those regulations. I think also because Andy has good friends in Dallas. He was always on a plane to Dallas or San Diego, different places, and probably was hearing stories of other people that were more open in their areas, and then he felt jealous or frustrated that he couldn't open his campuses. And Andy really wanted to preach in front of people. He did not want to preach on a screen. He wanted to have people there to hear his sermon. So that became really obvious as well. And there's just a lot of frustration Andy was carrying and a lot of panic. And the way that played out was cracking the whip on all of us, just really pushing us to work fast and furious and not pastoring the staff. We weren't feeling pastored. So all of us, like many of you listening, had kids in online school. Here in Santa Clara County, that meant a year and a half for us that kids were not allowed to go to public schools in person. And so the workload at home of having kids at home to homeschool, and trying to quarantine when people got COVID, and we all know what that was like. It was intense, and a lot of anxiety that our kids were carrying, and we were having struggles trying. Everybody was like, "How do we get groceries? How does this happen?" While at the same time, as soon as everything happened, Jason and I and Darren and a few others on our campus decided to start something called Echo.Compassion, because we, having done disaster relief and having a heart for outreach, we're thinking about our community. Well, we're kind of not in the at-risk category because of our age and we're not immunocompromised, but there are people who are, and how are they going to get their groceries? And what if they have medical needs that need met? And how can we love and serve our nurses and bring them coffee and, all those things. So we helped start a thing called Echo.Compassion, while we were also, for me, doing Facebook Lives, because we were supposed to try to keep engaging our campuses, because it became clear Andy was afraid he was losing his church. And because he was fearful, his power by fear was put onto us, his panic was put onto us. And instead of pastoring us and saying, "How are you doing? How's everybody feeling? Are you guys managing this workload well? How can we pace ourselves in a way that we're here for the long term?" Instead, it was like push, 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 more, more, more. And figuring out new ways to do things. So we were doing a lot more on Slack. I raised an entire team through Slack and with a Notion board of trying to project manage an entire team, sight unseen, recruited 25 people who were a scaled team. And it turns out that is how Echo works. It feels like on staff, you're a pyramid scheme builder. It wasn't told to me that way, but it turns out we hire you, and then you bring on a volunteer who leads other volunteers, who leads other volunteers. So the levels of volunteers underneath me were in a lot to make it all happen on a Sunday. But because of our heart for the community, we raised up Echo.Compassion. It felt like if we're going to put our efforts somewhere, this is where we can really make a difference during this time where people need us. So it was a full-time job just to be development director for Echo.Compassion. It was a rewarding job, but also I was doing pastoral work that I, as an associate campus pastor, needed to do for Facebook Lives and engaging people and doing, worship times online, a lot of stuff, while also trying to take care of our family and our 3 kids who really were still kind of figuring out America, and suddenly we're at middle school, high school, online. It was most people on staff were dual income households, because in the Bay Area, we have the highest property value in the United States. People live in small houses, so finding a room to quarantine in is almost impossible in most cases with multi-generational housing. And both parents need to work to make ends meet. And so people were really, really low on energy. People were really struggling. And so I was starting to see this happen. And then I also was having conversations with my boss, Darren, because he was often getting into arguments or sort of fights over things in the DLT that he was in. which is sort of the inner circle at Echo Church. And he would often say, hey, this, meeting went like this. And I pretty much, my regular response to him was, nobody's their best self right now. Andy's not his best self right now. Let's give him grace. He's really worried he's going to lose his church. He's panicking. And so he's not his best self right now. But looking back on it, now that I know what I know, I was excusing him and had my own betrayal blindness where I wasn't seeing that Andy was probably not being reasonable. And we were all going through COVID. So why were we so full of sympathy for Andy when all of us really needed a lot of sympathy and pastoral care, and no one was pastoring the staff? We were being run ragged and really exhausted within just a few months into COVID. So Jason can explain the strategic leadership team and what that was and the circumstances around which we got invited into it.
Yeah, I think another thing to add, that I remember you coming home and saying after, Darren was sharing some of the struggles and things that he was having with Andy, but also making the comment that, when you're in tech, if your boss is being a jerk, you can just move on. But it felt like, this is your pastor, this is your church. You have to work through it. You can't just give up. Um, which I thought, now looking back, when we think about spiritual abuse and where you feel pushed and you realize you sometimes are willing to put up with stuff, thinking, hey, this is our pastor, this is our spiritual leader, like we need to, just take some of this stuff or whatever. So, and that's like looking back. Again, it's funny when you come out of this stuff, you start looking back and you realize certain instances like that, and you have another framework to look at it that helps you realize, man, like that was already happening. This was what was going on then, even though at the time you just had this feeling in your gut, this is not right. Um, so yeah, so both Lori and I did stuff with Echo Compassion. My role was more in helping other churches do outreach, and so we actually had funding that was coming in, and I was finding ways to partner with even some of our other churches that we had sent funding to for helping out with their church plant, or even some other smaller churches that were, didn't have the funding to support their community, and so we began to actually give resources, actually mobilize volunteers to help them do their outreach, that sort of stuff, and really trying to serve the community. It was like super exciting, and it looked like, man, we're really showing that we're for the community and we're for the other churches around here. At one point, we'd even gave to, I think it was 5 churches. I think we gave like $10,000 to, super generous, which is great. And now looking back, um, it's like I know the motivation behind all that was not about loving the community. It was about trying to groom other smaller churches that might then recognize we could merge with them, which would eventually sell their property and we would gain resources. And um, yeah, which is so sad, because I just, in that moment, I was in this ideal state. I even had another pastor friend that was in another part of the Bay Area, and I was on the phone with him and like sharing, hey man, we just want to partner in that area of the Bay Area, and we're like, this is really just about supporting you. And he was like, man, I know your heart, Jason. And we'd been going to seminary together, and he was just like super cautionary. He was just like, I just know churches are going to be like thinking, having second guessing why Echo is really doing this and why they're wanting to do these sorts of partnerships with us. Is it really about helping us? And there's going to be some trust issues there. And I remember just thinking, gosh, man, you're being so cynical. And now looking back, I was like, that wasn't cynical, that was wisdom, because he'd been around long enough to realize, and other pastors around here have been long enough to recognize this. Anyway, so that then I think it was end of June or something like that. They invited us to be on the strategic leadership team, and we thought, okay, we've been here a year. Now we're being asked to be on the strategic leadership team, and we had in the full year we'd been there. I mean, Andy had never asked her opinion on anything. I can remember having my opinion being asked once in that whole year from Andy, and it had to do with some schedule thing. But we thought, okay, this is, which is fine. Like it's like, going in another culture, we're trying to learn, so that we weren't upset about that. But we're just kept thinking, man, is there a space where we can ask questions and try to understand stuff? And no, it was like, it's just about working for now. You'll get it. You'll figure it out. So then we're asked to be on the strategic leadership team, and we're thinking it's all those words. It's strategic, it's leadership, and we're a team. And it took a few meetings before I realized it was none of those words. Um, yeah, it was none of those words. But at the time, we thought, okay, this is the space where you can actually challenge and ask questions, and even being a part of helping think through some of the strategy and stuff like that. And I mean, Lori and I'd been on strategic leadership teams overseas. We'd been on a leadership team for the whole Southeast Asia, and had dealing with much more complicated situations than a church. And so, and not that we weren't like upset about it. We just kept thinking, okay, this is the space where we're going to be able to do that. And so it was the second meeting as we got on to that team, and I'm assuming this is the part you want to tell because this is you asking the question.
Yeah. Honestly, everything leading up to this moment, I look back on in hindsight as being naive, um, betrayal blindness for sure. And I had multiple people say little whispers of things that I'd pushed away. And I'd pushed those away because it was very clear within a month of getting on staff, this phrase, you will get fired for gossiping. And I remember thinking, that's very tyrannical. Why would somebody want to silence the staff from talking about things and like the punishment doesn't meet the crime? And also, I mean, not that I'm a person who wants to gossip or does gossip. I've not been accused of that in my life. That's not who I am. But the gossip definition felt so much bigger than what is actually the definition of gossip. And that also was very clear in the oxygen that we all breathed. So the ocean we were swimming in was just really don't talk about bad things. Contagious joy was one of the was one of the values, and it was put up on a poster on the wall, and it would be used like a weapon. So if you said something that sounded a little like you might be even complaining about how things run, it was like, oh, but contagious joy, kind of thing. And so that's the nature under which it felt like the fear that you could get fired for saying the wrong thing, even if it was way broader than actually what gossip is. So in that vein, I remember, and what I look back on was probably a fond response to trauma already. And fond response to trauma is where you basically want to cross every T and dot every I and be a people pleaser and never do anything wrong. And I remember because of the trauma of the power by fear that was not intense trauma, but it was sort of this underlying thing of working on a staff and being overworked and being on the verge of burnout like everybody was. And it was COVID and it was intense and our lives were just, when you hear people describe a cult, people are kept so busy they can't think or breathe. And it was like that. We were so busy, we couldn't think. We couldn't make critical decisions. We couldn't have a situation come our way and even know how to process it very well. And so I think that was sort of my fond response was like people were whispering things to me about the finances at Echo. And I would be like, please don't tell me about that. I don't want to know. It's like, well, have you known this or that? Oh, please don't tell me. Because I just remember thinking, I don't want to get fired because you gossiped to me. And it wouldn't have even been gossip. It was just more like work-related conversations I was afraid to have.
You had concerns.
I had serious concerns. Looking back, I am ashamed that I was that afraid. I was already being groomed at that point. I was already being ingratiated with all the things that ingratiate you at a place like that, where they say, everybody wants to work at Echo.Church. Look at our Echo Leadership Conference. Exponential is held here. Look at all these churches that are dying and sad and old white people and how diverse we are and just all the things that are said. And you think, wow, I guess this is as good as it gets around here. So you don't want to do anything to jeopardize it. And also for us, we had moved here from Singapore. This was our entire network. We lived in the North Bay, over 20 years ago, but we never fully lived in the South Bay, other than temporarily on a stateside assignment period. But so the thought of getting other jobs when it's COVID, like that wouldn't have even crossed our mind at that point. It's like, this is where we are. It's going to stay for now. So I had seen him get angry at other people. And I had heard him call people nicknames behind closed doors. So a lot of the abuse that goes on at Echo is not in large groups. It would be very one-on-one or 3 people in the room or just very, very small in Andy's office type of thing. And I'd heard him there's a couple of women on staff that he called Tweedledee and Tweedledum. I remember thinking that's a horrible thing to say. They're very hard workers. And he had other little nicknames for people. And he would say things just cutting and laugh about people. And it felt sort of strange and off, but people would explain it away like, oh, he's just Michael Scott from The Office. But we don't want Michael Scott from The Office to be our pastor, definitely not our lead pastor. But it very much felt like this narrative, Andy's just a toxic rock star. If you want a church that reaches the Bay Area, it's got to be different. He's like Elon Musk. Elon Musk works here, and this is the kind of pastor you need. And I remember kind of questioning it in my mind, but you're just so busy. You're like, oh, I guess I don't know anything. And that was sort of the gaslighting that went on, that we sort of, you just kind of do it with each other because it's like, this is how it is kind of thing. So in the strategic leadership team meeting, Andy came in, and everything had shut down in March 2020, as we all know. This was July 2020. We were exhausted by this point because there was no lazy sitting around in our pajamas half working. We were intense. I was doing what felt like 2 full-time jobs, sometimes more, and also trying to homeschool kids and just get groceries under difficult circumstances. And so when he came in, he basically said to the whole strategic leadership team, now we're going to drive 2 cars. And what that meant was the car we were currently driving, he called the digital car. This was his way of announcing we're opening up our campuses at a time when that was not happening by and large in the Bay Area with churches. You would see it happen, I guess, a bit in like maybe Texas or other places, but the Bay Area was not doing that. Because of a variety of reasons. Our situation is very urban, very dense, very intense, and our hospitals could easily get overwhelmed. And also because that happened, and he said, we're going to drive 2 cars, the imagery he was painting for us was the first car is the digital car. For me and my role, that meant the Facebook Lives, the worship times online, the making sure you're like interacting on Sunday service by getting in the chat and like reposting. And we were always encouraged to repost social media posts and come up with creative ideas to engage people online, and also lead all of the teams. I was leading with Alpha during the week, and then also doing Echo Compassion. There was just a lot of stuff digitally. I had a partnership that I arranged with DoorDash for Echo Compassion, and we were getting meals to people. And I was on the phone with Mayor Licardo's office in San Jose, trying to always find out how we could help them. There were just a lot of things we were doing. So the digital car for me was already way more than a full-time job. So when he announced we were going to add a whole other car, in my mind, I was expecting him to say, so we're going to have to slow the digital car down so we can do the in-person outdoor services 6 feet apart, socially distanced car. But instead, he said, you will not slow the first car down, same speed, full speed ahead, and you will add a whole other car, which is socially distanced outdoor services, which meant not an acoustic guitar being brought outside in a few chairs. It meant what Echo calls excellence. Everything had to be as much as possible like every other Sunday service had been before, just outside, which meant bringing all the thousands of dollars of equipment outside, having like it look nice out there, having chairs look nice, coffee, hand sanitizer, of course. We had to take temperatures, put stickers out there. It was like so much I didn't know if we were going to have any volunteers show up. So just the announcement of it, I think most of us on the staff that worked on the campuses had a big question mark over our heads. So I just happened to be the one who asked the question that turns out people told me later they had the same question. And I just only innocently, very curiously asked and respectfully, how is it possible to drive 2 cars, basically? Because I didn't really even understand the metaphor. And that's when, for the very first time, even though I had seen Andy angry at other people before, his anger turned directed straight toward me. And from then on, things have never, ever been the same. Thank you for listening to part 1, once again, of our story, where my husband and I share the beginning of 6 parts of what happened to us in spiritual abuse, psychological abuse, emotional abuse, and some financial abuse at Echo.Church in Silicon Valley. And if you are interested in hearing the rest of it and you didn't hear it before, or you want to rehear it once again, and if it's helpful in any way to understand what's happened to you or someone that you love, or just to be that elder at your church or a pastor or someone on staff, or even just a congregant or volunteer that wants to be aware of what spiritual abuse looks like, so you can be a part of the solution instead of being a complicit bystander that's silent in any way. Then we offer to you the other 5 parts of this series in the Our Story series from 2022. And you can find that on our podcast, wherever it is. And then I can also put links in the show notes for you to find the other episodes. And there are also some articles that were written that we end up referencing because as their story was unfolding, there were other articles being written. And since this story has been released on our podcast, there have been a few other articles that have been written, and the story continues to unfold. So we will continue to update you as things unfold. You can also go to my link tree for reference of certain articles, and I'll put that in the show notes as well. We've had a petition that has gone on to release the NDAs, and there's been another open letter that came out of someone at Echo.Church that we didn't know personally at the time, and just some others who have recognized some of the things that have been going on. So the story continues to evolve, and hopefully we'll be able to do a podcast at some point that shares a little bit more good news. But in the meantime, there's a lot of work to be done to raise awareness about spiritual abuse, to believe and center survivors, to dismantle the systems that spiritual abuse and narcissism can breed on a church staff where it is centered around one particular pastor or a pastor pair of an executive and a lead pastor. Over time, we have seen these systems breed all kinds of spiritual abuse. And so thank you for hanging in here with us as we have shared our story. And we would love to hear how it's resonated with you, round 2 or for the first time. Please reach out to us on Instagram, on Facebook, or on Twitter. And that's all in the show notes as well if you want to find us there. In the meantime, please take some deep breaths. This has been a heavy conversation, and go do something that helps your body feel safe and grounded. If you're in a warm place, it really does help just to walk barefoot on the grass. That really does help sometimes. Or get some sunshine on your face, whatever it is that makes you feel okay, because this has been a heavy conversation. And I thank you so much for holding space for me and for my husband, Jason, as we are walking this journey, trying to be as congruent as we can and just understanding that it's sunshine that's the best disinfectant. So go get some sunshine for yourself. And next week, we'll post another podcast that was popular from last year. Thank you so much for listening and for being just the best podcast community all around the world. We appreciate you so much. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye. As we're finishing this episode, if you're thinking, I really wish I could learn more or go a little bit deeper, well, that's what our Difference Maker community is for. I would love to welcome you in to join the rest of us there. Once again, it's only $5 a month to join, the price of a latte at your local coffee shop. You can join at our Changers tier. Difference Makers is a community that really means so much to me. It's very special because each time I have a guest on the show, I record something outside of what we give to just the regular podcast audience, where we go a little bit deeper. And then I post those video episodes in this community and we can discuss them. But also at the very beginning tier, which is our Changers tier of this community, you'll get exclusive voting power and help pick podcast topics that give us, more of what we want from your perspective. You'll have access to exclusive 30 plus mini-sodes that aren't out there for the general public. And you'll get every month an exclusive monthly bonus mini-sode. At our Groundbreakers level, which is $10 a month, you can join and get all of that, but also priority access to submit questions to the podcast. And you'll get an additional 2 exclusive monthly bonus mini-sodes. And at our Trailblazers tier, which is $15 a month, the price of 3 lattes a month, you can get all of that plus also 3 exclusive monthly bonus minisodes, and a patron shout out. So I would love for you to join us at any of those tiers. It'll help you come into this community, be in the midst of all of us, other difference makers, and we'd love to hear your perspective. I certainly would. It's a place to engage more with me and the audience around what you like, what you're resonating with, and once again, go deeper with each of our guests. So please join us in this membership community. I would love to hear your perspective and love to share this extra content with you. So show up at patreon.com/a world of difference.